Hazardous substances, they're all around us. And in the world of real estate, with the disclosure requirements, if we know about them, we're going to need to disclose them. And here's the thing I can tell you, they can have an effect on value, but some things have more importance than others. Let's go ahead and listen in with our 30-year expert on home inspections about hazardous substances and what they really mean inside the home.
Hi, I'm Doug. I'm a home inspector. I've been doing home inspections for 30 years. About the last 5 years or so, environmental hazards have become a big part of the real estate community. It seems that the consumers themselves are very concerned about air quality. That's what environmental hazards are. They upset the air quality in a home. Environmental hazards have never been a bigger concern than they are now, and I want you to know as a real estate professional, they're going to continue to grow. This subject is not going to go away. It's almost a generational concern. What I mean by that is this. If you're dealing with older buyers of a home, they're probably less concerned, more understanding over the issue of environmental hazards. Whereas if you're working with a first-time home buyer, maybe a millennial or a younger person, say under 40, 45 years old, their sensitivity to this issue is going to be much greater. I also want you to know that as you start selling newer homes, the newer the home, or if the home has been significantly modernized and rehabbed, the tighter the home is going to be. And the tighter the home is, the greater the concern there is for environmental hazards. So, what an old home might have been at one time with regards to some environmental concern might be far different today, just based on the fact that they've modernized the home. Why is this becoming such an issue in the real estate marketplace right now? Well, the EPA has been at this for a long time. That's the Environmental Protection Agency. They've always increased their concerns about environmental hazards. They've also changed a lot of what their protocols are over the years. There's nothing wrong with that, but the more we hear about it as a society, the more we become concerned about it. The second reason is that local and national building codes in most communities now are actually addressing this issue of environmental hazards. For example, according to the International Residential Code, you have to put in a radon pipe mitigation even if you don't have high radon levels in the home. It became a code issue. Once the consumer saw that, they said, hey, I am more concerned about that particular issue. The third part of that is purchase agreements. I know you know what your purchase agreement looks like, but I'm not sure if you're aware of how the seller looks at it and sees all these disclaimers and disclosures with regards to environmental hazards. Again, in the back of their mind, they're saying, hey, look, I need to look into this matter. And the last reason why this is starting to grow so much is our seller's disclosures. The seller is also required, if they know anything about lead or radon or asbestos or any of the other hazards that we're going to be talking about, that they're required to disclose that. Now, that doesn't mean they know much about it, but it does mean that it is another touch point where the buyer of the home is starting to see that environmental hazards may impact them when they move in. A second real important key item, that point that I'd like to make with you has to do with EPA protocols. What I want you to know is each environmental hazard doesn't have an EPA protocol. So in other words, what are you comparing, whatever the technical test disclosed, what are you comparing it to? If you have a protocol, you can compare it to that, and that's good. But if you don't have a protocol, all you're doing is getting information that doesn't have much value to it. The second thing with regards to that is that these protocols change over time. Example, 4.0 picocuries is the cutoff point for radon. They're talking about changing that now. It hasn't changed yet. I don't mean to imply that, but they're going to lower that. So again, things change and the consumer starts to get somewhat mixed up over this. So at one point, if you tested for something and it was at this level, and they go to sell their home 3 years from now and it's at a different level or a different EPA protocol, they're going to wonder how you made a mistake when you originally got involved in that testing system. So, be careful with environmental hazards. As a real estate professional, I want you to know that as you talk to other people in your community, some people will even argue whether something is a concern or not. Don't you do that. If the buyer of the home is concerned about an environmental hazard, let them test for it. Don't take on that liability. The second thing you should do as a real estate professional is understand a little bit about what these key environmental hazards are, know what their characteristics are, and maybe know a little bit about where you'd go to find out where the problem is. So maybe you can be kind of looking at things as you go through. I don't want you to become an expert. I just want you to be aware as you're walking through the home. Okay? As a business person, I also want you to know that everybody decides how they're going to handle this issue. Home inspectors decide how they're going to handle the issue. Appraisers understand how they have a policy on how they're going to handle the issue, and you should too. Don't go willy-nilly on this issue. Set a method on how you're going to deal with this and then follow it. Otherwise, you have a risk of being all over the map, and at some point in time, you're going to get whacked, and that's going to hurt. Well, let's start out by looking at the concern about lead paint. Now, this concern has been around for a long, long time, and it affects certain ages of houses. Example, on a 1979 home or greater, chances of finding lead paint are slim to none. Okay? When you're starting to look at a home from about 1960 to 1970, what you'll find is some lead paint typically, but normally it is a low level of lead. Whereas when you look at homes prior to 1960, the lead concentrations are going to be very high. Now, regarding the concern of the consumer, I would characterize this as a medium concern to the consumer. They want to be made aware of it, but I'm not familiar with, as a home inspector, where my customer has either renegotiated or backed out of a home because it had lead-based paint in it. So again, it's a little bit more informational than it is problematic for the real estate transaction. Where do you find lead paint? Well, you find it on trim. You can find it on painted trim. It would have to be oil-based. You can find it on painted doors, painted cabinets. Now, by the way, this could be interior or exterior. Either one could have lead paint on it. All right? How do you deal with the lead paint issue? Or how do you know that it's even there? The only way to know that you have lead in the paint is you can buy a little test kit at Home Depot, Menards, Lowe's, any discount lumber yard, or probably hardware store, and you can put a little swab on there and it'll tell you whether you've got lead paint in there and to what level. Lead was used as a pigment in oil-based paint and as a drying agent. That's why they used it prior to 1978. Again, I want to emphasize it can be in colored paint, it can be in white paint, but it can also be in stains and varnishes. So make sure that if you're concerned about it, or your customer, more importantly, is concerned, that they would check all of those areas of the house. How do you deal with lead paint if you're going to deal with it? There's two methods. One is you can remove it. Removing it is awful expensive, and there's a law now that requires how you move it. The issue being is that you don't want to just rip lead-based paint off and the dust and the fibers start circulating in the air. You would have to have it professionally cleaned after you did that in order to make sure that there wasn't paint dust that had lead in it and paint chips that had lead in it in the house. The other and the most practical way, and the one that most people use most often, is they encapsulate it. That's a fancy word for saying painting over it. But keep in mind, you have to prepare the paint. Usually they have a liquid etcher that you would wash the old lead paint with, and then you apply the new paint so that it would stick properly. What are the concerns with this? They're legitimate. They're very legitimate, particularly when you're talking about children and pregnant women, or women that are considering getting pregnant in the future. Issues, learning disabilities for children. Issue, development delays and how they progress in school and in their methodology and personality. Reduced height actually can be an impact of a child getting intoxicated with lead-based paint. Another one would be poor hearing. Now, as I told you earlier, there's a law, and there's been a law for a long time, and this law affects buyers, sellers, and renters. And what it's called is the Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act of 1992. All right? And that requires disclosure in a real estate transaction or a rental transaction that the owner has to disclose of any known areas that would have any lead in them in that particular residence. The other law I would like to have you know about is the 2008 Renovation, Paint, and Repair Act. Again, a federal law. And what this law says is that if you're a professional or if you're a homeowner and you're disturbing something like removing a window or removing a door, and you're going to either repaint it or put in a new one, that you have to use lead-based paint protection mechanisms and methods in order to do that. Example, you'd have to tarp off the window and make sure that you go in there in white clothes that are disposable. You have to roll everything up in the plastic that was laid down on the earth to make sure no chips go anywhere. It obviously increases the cost of doing some of this remodeling, but on the same token, it does protect the consumer with regards to the lead issue. Again, one more time, lead to me and my experience as a home inspector is a medium concern to the consumer. Carbon monoxide is also an environmental hazard, and it is a very big concern to the buyer of the home. The home inspector technically should be looking for carbon monoxide, so it's not something that you have to have an independent test done in a real estate transaction. Carbon monoxide is a colorless, tasteless gas that's produced by burning wood, gas, or oil. We call them combustion appliances. So example, a furnace is a combustion appliance. If you look in here, you'll see the flame going of the furnace. When a furnace is burning properly, what's called complete combustion. Complete combustion exhausts certain byproducts through the exhaust of this system. The primary byproducts are carbon dioxide, which you need to live, and water vapor. The concern with the flame then is if you're having incomplete combustion. Because if this is not burning properly, what happens is you start exhausting carbon dioxide again, water vapor, H2O again, but you also begin to produce carbon monoxide. And that's always the concern with this particular type of appliance. This could be wood stoves, this could be fireplaces, this could be gas water heaters or oil water heaters. There's different appliances that this can happen to, but it always has to do with the condition of the flame. So the question is, how do you have incomplete combustion of an appliance like this? There's three basic ways you can have incomplete combustion. Number one, if you don't supply an appliance like this enough air, okay? Air, about 19% of air is oxygen. We need oxygen to come in here, enough of it to supply it so we'll have complete combustion. If we don't have enough oxygen, rather than make CO2, we'll make CO1, which is carbon monoxide. The second way that you can create carbon monoxide out of this type of an appliance is if it's so badly out of adjustment, so dirty, so the filter has not been changed. So you can actually have a malfunction of the equipment itself by lack of good maintenance, and it can produce carbon monoxide. So what I'm telling you is a bad furnace can create carbon monoxide. And a new furnace can create carbon monoxide if it's not well taken care of. The last way that you create carbon monoxide is by having a leak in this system. So the heart of this system, where that flame is burning, all of that hot gases has to go out of this exhaust pipe. If that, called the heat exchanger, had a hole or a crack in it, some of the gases that are supposed to be going out of the exhaust get into the airstream of the home. We burn them a second time, and we burn off one of the O's and start making carbon monoxide. So the reburn of exhaust products is the third way that you create carbon monoxide. So how does a homeowner begin to manage this issue of carbon monoxide? First of all, every home should have a CO detector. CO detectors can be standalone, or you can actually buy them now where they're combined with the smoke detector. But regardless, you need a carbon monoxide detector. The second thing that you should understand is that we need to make sure that the physical condition of the furnace is good. It's not rusted out, it's not scorched, it doesn't have those things that the home inspector is looking for. If a home inspector told you that your furnace is all worn and rusted, that's a bad thing, because you might not be producing carbon monoxide now, but you might be in the near future, and unfortunately you're just not going to know when. The best way to test for carbon monoxide production would be for a heating contractor who has an expensive piece of technical equipment that they drill a hole in the exhaust pipe, they'd stick a probe in there, and that would tell them what the concentration of carbon monoxide is in that home. And that is the best way to determine it. My recommendation is that that should be done once a year to make sure that that equipment is operating properly. So what are the fixes to all of this? Remember that we had to have enough air to produce CO2 rather than carbon monoxide. So a good thing to have in the house is what we call make-up air. This is just an insulated pipe that brings cold air in from outside the home. Okay, it's looped up so that the cold air doesn't drop to the floor and have people's feet get cold. But this is bringing in air. So now, every time this furnace sucks for air, it's getting nice, clean, and all the air that it would like to have. The other thing that you can do to protect against carbon monoxide in the home is to not only have a carbon monoxide test, but have them service the furnace, clean it, adjust it, do all of those things that are necessary. Now, sometimes furnaces are just too old to fix, and that's where these professional technicians can tell you that your furnace is either due to be replaced or knocking on the door. And the last solution to a carbon monoxide problem in the home would be to replace the appliance. So let's assume that you didn't do all the things we talked about regarding the servicing of the furnace, or having a carbon monoxide test by a professional, or even having a carbon monoxide detector in the home. How about you recognize that you've got a problem in a house that has a high level of carbon monoxide concentration? First of all, you need to understand that the body absorbs carbon monoxide. And when it does, it inhibits the ability of our blood to transfer oxygen to where it needs to go. The first sign of carbon monoxide is typically dizziness. The second sign of a problem that's a little bit more severe would actually be nauseous. I've heard people describe it as almost like flu-like symptoms. If carbon monoxide concentration gets too terribly high, you're really actually talking about the possibility of death. It's a problem, but it's a problem that we should be able to manage if we, again, test and service our equipment. Cfcs Chlorofluorocarbons are a non-toxic, non-flammable chemical used in refrigerant lines. Where you're going to find them in a residential home are going to be in the refrigerant system of an air conditioner, a refrigerator, possibly a freezer as well. These actually, to the buying public of a home, are of little concern. I don't know that anyone's ever asked me about CFCs in their house. Do understand that it has affected the way equipment is being manufactured today. In the old days, the refrigerant, these are the refrigerant lines for your air conditioner. The air conditioner cycles between a coil above the furnace or the air handler, and then outside there's going to be another coil. So the refrigerant in these pipes cycles from coil to coil. The refrigerant that is used in the old days was called R222. R22 had a negative impact on the ozone layer of our universe. So the bottom line is the federal government came out and said, we need something that is a refrigerant that is more ozone friendly. And that is called R410A. So the concern with CFCs is the depletion of the ozone layer. One more time, I don't think you're going to find this to be an issue or a concern in a typical real estate transaction. The concern about radon is huge. Buyers of homes are very concerned about the radon issue. Regardless of generations. It just seems that radon, because of the EPA's involvement in it, their marketing and their concern with it and how they've publicized that, has gotten people very concerned about the radon issue. The second thing is that it's now a part of the building code. So as you build new homes today, the issue of radon is addressed and has to be somewhat mitigated in the construction of that home. The third reason is in your purchase agreement. In a typical real estate transaction purchase agreement, it does ask about the radon issue. So this is coming to the forefront of the buyer of a home, and they're going to say whether or not they want to have to make that decision. Do I want to have a radon test or do I not want to have a radon test? Remember that radon is a naturally occurring, colorless, odorless, tasteless gas caused by the natural decay of uranium and radium under the soil. It's in the earth. Just because this home has the same earth as it does next door doesn't mean that this home has it and that home doesn't have it. It doesn't travel that way. It has a lot to do with the makeup of the home and the way that people live in that home. How do you know you got radon? There's absolutely no way of telling short of testing for radon. How do you want to test for radon? There's two basic methods in a real estate transaction. Before I tell you those two methods, I do want you to know a long-term test is the most reliable test, and that should be done by a buyer of a home when they're living in the home. Having said that, to get an indication of what radon levels may be in this home, we use charcoal canisters. Now, a homeowner can buy these at a local store of some sort, like a discount lumber yard or something like that, or a hardware store, and they can put these in their basement. Okay. Normally, we put it in the lowest portion of the home. All right? You set it about waist high off of the ground. You set it somewhere in the middle of the basement. Try not to have it on an outside wall. Try not to have it around supply and return air registers. Leave it there for 48 hours. Make sure that the house and all the windows and doors are kept closed for that 48-hour period of testing. Then you put these, seal them back up, and you mail them off. Another type of testing is electronic monitors. You'll probably find home inspectors do most testing in a real estate transaction as a part of their home inspection. They usually use electronic monitors. A little bit more reliable, and their monitor systems are tamper-proof, so you don't have to worry about a problem with someone covering these canisters and getting a batting. I want to also tell you that the action level of 4.0 is somewhat ambiguous. That's something the EPA established. Again, it doesn't mean you want any, and it doesn't mean that 4.1 is terribly bad. It's just some sort of a protocol that they have established to give us some sort of a guide about what approximately a radon level should be in a home. How do you fix radon? You could start by filling all the cracks in the basement and on the foundation walls so that, again, that gas doesn't seep through the earth and come into the basement. All right? The second way would be to pressurize the basement. Blow a fan down here. if the basement is depressurized because the appliances are going on and off, you want to make sure that, again, it doesn't pull that radon gas in through the cracks. But quite frankly, my friends, the best way to do it is with a subslab suction system. All this is a pipe where they drilled a hole in the floor slab, put the pipe down into the ground, all right? There's two types of subslab suction. One is called passive. It's just a pipe that goes all the way out through the roof, above the roof line. And they also have what's called an active system. That's where they put a fan on it, typically up in the attic or on the outside of the home. That'll assist in pulling that radon gas out of the home. It is fixable in every situation. Formaldehyde is a chemical product that's inside a lot of our press boards, our woods that are put together and glued together. It's pretty pronounced odor. It's normally pretty commonly smelled when you come into a home. Typically where you see this is going to be in new construction, and you're going to see it in major remodeling of some of our properties. The formaldehyde is a preservative agent, but what it does is it emits a gas, and that's what you smell. That off-gassing is where we're concerned about it from a health perspective. Formaldehyde is a VOC. VOC stands for volatile organic compound. There's a lot of them in homes. This is just one of them. But the largest concern is the off-gassing of the formaldehyde in the home. Generally where we're going to find it is in particle boards in floors and cabinets. We're going to find it in sheathings, in floor sheathings, wall sheathings, roof sheathings. We're going to find it in manufactured sidings today. We'll have products with formaldehyde in them. And we certainly find it quite frequently, or almost all of the time, in our carpets. The good thing about formaldehyde is it off-gasses. So after a period of time that it's been in the home, the concentration will be less and less and less and less, and it gets to the point where typically it's not even noticed. The concern, though, is respiratory problems. The concern is eye and skin irritation. I don't know if you've ever heard of the sick building syndrome, but the sick building syndrome is where somebody always tells you that they're sick and they can't figure out why, and it's always they feel the worst when they're inside the home. I'm not suggesting it's always formaldehyde, but that can have an impact on the sick building syndrome. How do you tell if you've got formaldehyde? Most of the time you can just simply smell it. But if you're concerned, if you're a super sensitive person or your customer is a super sensitive person, you could actually have what's called an industrial hygienist sample the air in a house. They'll tell you the levels of aldehydes or formaldehyde in the home, or you can just wait for the product to off-gas. Formaldehyde is a difficult thing to target, so do know that there needs to be some patience. So make sure that you understand if someone's weeping in their eyes when you're showing them homes, that you become a little bit concerned about the issue of formaldehyde. The concern about mold. It also is huge to the consumer. Mold is not only a health issue, but this particular environmental hazard also has the capability of damaging the building itself. We've had a lot of problems with mold over the last 20 some odd years. It's not that we didn't have it before, but it's just right now we're finding it to be a very, very problem with our construction. If you have no moisture and if you have no organic food, you won't have mold. So where does mold come from? It comes from either exterior originated moisture or interior originated moisture. And the food is the building materials. Your wood, your insulation. It loves it. Those products are called hygroscopic. What that means is they act like a sponge. They got pores. And when there's a bit of moisture, not a lot, but even just a little bit, what happens is that moisture gets absorbed into the building product and begins to form as a mold. Now, I should let you know that if you had a water event in a building and you cleaned up that water event within 48, some people will say 72 hours, mold will not set in if it's professionally cleaned. However, if it's not dealt with in that period of time, you have mold. Let's be honest, most homes have some mold. As a general rule, it isn't going to be problematic to most people, but again, it depends a little bit on the volume, it depends on the sensitivity and concern of the customer. What causes moisture to get into a home? Poor ventilation and poor insulation. This particular product here with holes in the plastic, moisture would travel right through the plastic, warm moist air, and would condense on the back of the sheathing, which would again absorb that moisture and then create mold. Leaks in the basement. The biggest problem you see typically in housing is the grading around the home. When water comes in, it damages things. If it's finished materials, those will absorb that moisture and mold will begin to be created. So sometimes you just need to know that there had been a water event to know whether or not the likelihood of mold behind those materials in the basement is high or whether the likelihood is low. Some of our claddings, what I mean by that is our exterior sidings, are the biggest culprit of the mold problem in homes. This is the one you're hearing a lot about today. You probably have heard a little bit about the problems with stucco homes and brick homes. Those are what we call face-sealed claddings. Face-sealed claddings means they don't breathe. Brick isn't waterproof, stucco isn't waterproof. Moisture gets to the back of the brick and the stucco. If it doesn't have a method to get out, it creates mold. And what we found is that many homes have been devastated by the mold just because of poorly installed insulation and ventilation. How do you test for mold? One way to do it is with the industrial hygienist again. They can put in a little piece of equipment in here and determine, leave it there for a couple days and it'll tell you how much mold spores are in the air. A second way is through a visual analysis by a home inspector. I'm often asked, can you tell me if there's mold in the home? All I need to determine is, has water come in through the basement, through the roof, through the walls, through the windows? If it has, my answer is you do have some mold in that particular home. Normally you want something a little more precise than that. Thermal or infrared thermography, where there's a camera that can take a reading on the walls. That could tell you whether you got moisture in there, or they actually have insulation or probes that you can put into a wall that will tell you what the moisture concentration of that wall would be. Here's the bottom line. All homes, as a general rule, have some mold in them. Mold destroys what it grows on. Mold goes dormant, but can rebloom. So in other words, you could have mold on these walls, discoloration, and it's not having an impact on anything right now, and a year from now, all of a sudden it starts to bloom again and starts to become more of a growing fungus. All right? A lot of people have allergic reactions to mold. You have to be sensitive to somebody that feels uncomfortable in a home. So, how do you fix mold? Determine the source of the moisture. Number two, replace all of the building materials that have been water damaged, or encapsulate those building materials. If there hasn't been a lot of mold destroying the wood products or the insulation products themselves, you can actually use a fungicide paint to encapsulate those mold spores so they don't regrow and create a problem for that particular home. Mold is a big deal. In real estate, asbestos concerns have been around for probably longer than any of the other environmental concerns. But I would say today in a real estate transaction, I would call asbestos more of a generational concern. Most older people have reached the conclusion that there's a lot of asbestos in our older homes and we're going to have to live with it. Whereas if you're a new home buyer or a younger person, you don't feel that way, and many times you're more concerned about the asbestos issue. Asbestos has been banned since about 1978. It's a microscopic mineral fiber. It worked really well in our homes. It's a great noise absorber. It's a good insulator. It's a good product because it's non-combustible and we could put it close to things that got hot. The problem with asbestos is the fibers, and the asbestos fibers, when they get put into someone's lungs, are permanent. They never go away. If we disturb asbestos in a home, say on a pipe of a boiler or something along those lines, those fibers will circulate forever or until that building is professionally cleaned. So it is a concern of reasonable substance. Do keep in mind, though, most of our asbestos in our homes today are embedded in building materials. Those typically are not a problem. Wall sidings, roof shingles, some of our wall boards, our floor tiles have asbestos fibers in them. Unless we break them or start disturbing them, as a general rule, they're not a health threat. Okay? We call those non-friable, whereas the loose fibers are called friable. How do you test for asbestos? Quite frankly, you look at the products themselves and you got a pretty good indication of whether or not they're asbestos. Example, the insulation on our old boilers and furnaces, or maybe the pipes they were used to distribute that heat throughout the home. Maybe the size of floor tiles on the ceiling or the wall. Maybe just the era of the home. So you can get an indication without doing any testing. However, if you want to quantify it and be precise about the effects or the existence of any type of asbestos products in the home, you're going to need to test. How do you deal with the issue? Number one, don't disturb it. Remember, when those fibers become friable or loose, they're harmful until they're professionally cleaned up. So you're going to have it professionally done by certified contractors, where they're going to put drop cloths down and use all sorts of safety clothes and respiration equipment to make sure that they protect themselves. The other fix is what we call encapsulating. Encapsulating is the most common. That's where either you paint the asbestos to keep the fibers tight on the building materials, or sometimes they'll actually wrap it in plastic or duct tape. So, if they got a problem with it, we want you to know that it's not a health threat if it's embedded into the materials. But if it isn't, it's a serious respiratory concern, and it's something that should be taken seriously. You know, we've had a chance to talk about a lot of different types of environmental concerns in the home. Some of them are a bigger concern than others. But I do want you to know that it's important as a real estate professional that you get your arms around what they are and try to recognize them as much as possible so that you can direct and guide your people better. This issue has never been bigger, and it's going to continue to grow. You may find some of these issues arguable about how big of a deal they are, but that's not what your job is. Don't pass judgment on that. If people want to have something tested, let them have it tested. Remember that EPA protocols can change, and that in some instances there aren't any EPA protocols in order to compare the product to. Example of that would be mold. How much mold? Okay, what kind of mold? Okay, that hasn't been quantified yet. Understand the characteristics then of these hazards, understand where they might be found, and establish a policy for your small real estate sales business. How are you going to handle this? How are you going to address it? Are you going to confront the buyers with your knowledge, or are you going to direct them to where they should go? That's something that you need to decide as you go forward.
Hazardous substances and disclosures. Some of the things that we have to disclose by law are already all spelled out. Other things may be your own personal convictions or an environmental hot button in your area where you're doing business. Understanding the impact of hazardous substances that can or cannot be found in the home and how they're discovered is a part of real estate. And having a firm grip of how you're going to handle hazardous substances when you come across them with a client, both buyers and sellers, is an important part of that career as a real estate expert.